There is a book in your Bible where God's name is never mentioned, not once. Esther is the only book in the Hebrew Bible that does not contain the divine name. Scholars have noticed this for thousands of years. Sermons have been built around the silence. Whole devotional traditions have grown up around the question of where God is when God is not named. But there is a longer version of Esther, the version most Christians in the world still read today. A version where Esther prays, where Mordecai dreams, where the king's decrees are quoted directly, where God is named again and again and again. 6 full chapters that most modern Protestants no longer see. Today, we read the Esther the rest of the Church has never let go. The book of Esther in most Protestant Bibles today has 10 chapters. The book of Esther in Catholic Bibles and Orthodox Bibles has 16. So did the original King James Bible for its first 270 years. The extra 6 chapters are called the additions to Esther. They are preserved in the Septuagint. They have sat inside the Christian Bible for nearly 2,000 years. And they tell you the same story, with God put back into the room. Today, we walk through what is in those chapters and what changes when you read them. Start with the silence. The Hebrew Esther is 10 chapters long. It tells the story of a young Jewish woman in Persia who becomes queen after the previous queen, Vashti, is deposed. It tells the story of her uncle Mordecai. It tells the story of Haman, the king's vizier, who tries to exterminate the Jews of the empire. And it tells the story of how Esther risks her life, exposes Haman, and saves her people. The result is the Jewish festival of Purim, a celebration of deliverance that Jews still observe every spring. The story is dramatic. The story is well told. But the story has one strange feature. God's name is never mentioned. Not Yahweh, not Elohim, not Adonai, not El Shaddai, not any of the divine titles that appear hundreds of times in every other book of the Hebrew Bible, not even in passing. This is so unusual that the rabbis themselves debated whether Esther should be in the canon. The book was one of the last accepted into the Hebrew Bible. The Talmud in Megillah 7a records real disagreement over whether Esther was divinely inspired, over whether Purim was truly binding, over whether a book that does not name God belongs alongside the rest of Scripture. The standard defense is that God is everywhere in Esther by absence. The improbable coincidences, the king's insomnia, the dropped clue, the exact timing of every reversal. The traditional reading says God is acting through providence, hidden behind the unfolding events, never named because the story is set in a Gentile court where the divine name is not safe to speak. That reading has produced beautiful sermons. The book where God hides in plain sight. The book about the providence of God working through a young woman who never asks for the throne. But here is the detail most modern Christians never learn. The original Greek translation of Esther does not have this silence. It is the version in the Septuagint, the Bible most early Christians actually read. The Greek Esther has 6 additional sections that the Hebrew Esther does not have. 6 chapters worth of material. In those chapters, God is named explicitly. Esther prays a long prayer. Mordecai has a prophetic dream. The royal decrees Haman writes are quoted in full, and the divine name appears repeatedly. These additions were not invented by Christians. They were added in the centuries before Christ by Jewish scribes working in Greek, almost certainly in Alexandria. The Septuagint Esther was the version of the book that circulated in the Greek-speaking Jewish world. It was the version Paul's churches would have known. It was the version the early church inherited. That is why every major Christian Bible in the early centuries contained these chapters, and every major Catholic and Orthodox Bible still does. Catholics and Orthodox call them deuterocanonical scripture, read in church, preached on, quoted in the lectionary. Roughly 2/3 of the world's Christians open a Bible that has them. The two traditions arrange the editions slightly differently. Orthodox Bibles preserve the Septuagint order, the editions interspersed in their original narrative positions. Mordecai's dream opens the book. Esther's prayer sits inside the story of her fast. The royal decrees appear where the action calls for them. When Jerome made the Latin Vulgate around the year 400, he doubted the additions because he could not find them in Hebrew. So he gathered them and appended them to the end. Modern Catholic translations have largely restored the interspersed order. The Reformation tightened the Protestant canon to the Hebrew Bible's shorter list, but the additions did not disappear overnight. Luther's 1534 German Bible kept them in a separate Apocrypha section. The King James Bible of 1611 did the same. For nearly 300 years, the English Protestant who opened a KJV found a section called The Rest of Esther, sitting between Malachi and Matthew. The unwinding came in stages. The British and Foreign Bible Society dropped the Apocrypha from its English Bibles in 1804, then cut funding for any edition that contained it in 1826. By the late 19th century, most Protestant Bibles no longer carried the editions at all. The complete absence is only about 140 years old. That is how the Esther most modern Protestants know became the book without God in it. The Greek Esther opens differently from the Hebrew Esther. Before the story of Vashti, before the introduction of Esther herself, the Septuagint inserts a prologue. It is called Edition A in the standard scholarly numbering. It is a dream. The dream is given to Mordecai. Listen to the text. In the 2nd year of the reign of Ahasuerus the Great, on the 1st day of Nisan, Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Jew living in the city of Susa, a great man serving in the court of the king, had a dream. Notice the genealogy. 3 generations of names. The same Benjamin who was Saul's tribe. The same Benjamin Jonathan came from. Mordecai is being placed in a specific lineage before the story begins. Then the dream itself. And this was his dream. There was noise and confusion, thunder and earthquake, tumult on the earth. Then 2 great dragons came forward, both ready to fight, and they roared terribly. At their roaring, every nation prepared for war, to fight against the righteous nation. It was a day of darkness and gloom, of tribulation and distress, affliction, and great tumult on the earth. And the whole righteous nation was troubled. They feared the evils that threatened them, and were ready to perish. 2 dragons, a righteous nation under siege, darkness, tumult. The vocabulary is apocalyptic. The dream is unmistakably in the same family as the visions of Daniel. Then they cried out to God, and from their cry, as though from a tiny spring, there came a great river with abundant water. Light came, and the sun rose, and the lowly were exalted, and devoured those held in honor. A cry to God, a river from a spring. The text uses the Greek word theos, God. The divine name is in the very first paragraph of the book. There is no hiding. The Septuagint Esther begins by telling you who is moving the events, and the dream is interpreted later in the book. The 2 dragons turn out to be Haman and Mordecai himself. The river is Esther. The tiny spring that became a flood is the small voice of a young woman whose courage saved a people. That is the engine under the whole story in the Greek version. Mordecai's dream is the lens through which everything that follows is read. The reader knows from page 1 that this is not a court intrigue. This is a cosmic battle between two dragons, with God at the center, and a young woman becoming a river. The Hebrew Esther does not have this prologue. The reader is dropped into the story without a frame. The Greek Esther tells you, before you read a single line, that the events you are about to witness are the answer to a prayer. That is the difference. Same story, different shape, different sound. And there is a structural pattern in the additions. The dream comes at the very beginning. The interpretation of the dream comes at the very end. Together, they form a frame around the entire book. Like a song that opens with a melody and closes with the same melody. The Hebrew Esther does not have this frame. It begins with a king's feast and ends with a tax decree. The Greek Esther begins with a vision and ends with a vision interpreted. The shape of the book itself has been reorganized by the additions. The most dramatic of the additions sits in the middle of the book. In the Hebrew Esther, chapter 4 contains one of the most famous lines in the Bible. Mordecai sends word to Esther that Haman's decree of extermination has been signed. Esther sends word back that she cannot approach the king unbidden without risking her life. And Mordecai answers, "For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" The Hebrew chapter ends with Esther's reply, "If I perish, I perish." Then chapter 5 opens. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace. What happened on those 3 days? The Hebrew text does not say. There is a gap. Esther fasts, her maidens fast, the Jews of Susa fast, and on the third day she walks into the king's presence. The Greek Esther fills the gap. Addition C is the prayer of Mordecai and the prayer of Esther. Both prayed during those 3 days of fasting, both preserved in full. Mordecai's prayer is theological. O Lord, Lord, you rule as king over all things, for the universe is in your power, and there is no one who can oppose you when it is your will to save Israel. For you have made heaven and earth and every wonderful thing under heaven. You are Lord of all, and there is no one who can resist you, the Lord. Esther's prayer is personal. She removes her royal robes. She covers herself in ashes. She loosens her hair, and she prays. "O my Lord, you only are our King. Help me, who am alone and have no helper but you, for my danger is in my hand. Ever since I was born, I have heard in the tribe of my family that you, O Lord, took Israel out of all the nations, and our ancestors from among all their forebears for an everlasting inheritance, and that you did for them all that you promised." The prayer continues. Esther confesses her fear of approaching the king. She confesses her aversion to the royal life she has been forced into. She tells God that she has not eaten at Haman's table, has not honored the king's feasts, has not taken pride in her position. And then, "Save us by your hand, and help me, who am alone and have no one but you, O Lord." Read that prayer once, and the silence of the Hebrew chapter changes. The empty gap between "if I perish, I perish" and "on the third day" is not empty. It is filled with the words of a young woman on the floor in ashes, telling God she is alone. The Hebrew Esther never lets you hear her voice in those 3 days. The Greek Esther lets you hear nothing else. That is the difference one chapter makes. The Esther most modern Protestants read is silent at the most important moment of her life. The Esther the early church read, and the Esther most Catholic and Orthodox Christians still read today, is praying at that moment, and the two are not in conflict. The same story, the Greek version restores the part the editor kept off the page. The Greek Esther also gives you something the Hebrew Esther only summarizes: the actual text of the royal decrees. In the Hebrew Esther 3:13, Haman's decree of extermination is mentioned but not quoted. The reader is told that letters went out commanding the destruction of every Jew in the empire on a single day, with their property to be plundered. The decree is summarized in a single verse. The Greek Esther, in Edition B, gives you the full text: the opening of Haman's decree, the reasoning, the threats, the closing curse on anyone who fails to comply. It is a chilling document. It is the kind of text the world has seen too many times in the centuries since. A government decree against an entire people, written in formal court language with all the gravity of state authority behind it. And later, in Edition E, the Greek text gives you the king's counter-decree, the one that reverses Haman's order and authorizes the Jews to defend themselves. That decree, too, is quoted in full. Read together. The two documents in Edition B and Edition E form a kind of literary diptych. Two letters, one ordering death, one ordering life, both signed by the same king. The Greek Esther wants you to see how easily a Persian government turns from one to the other when the right person stands in the right room at the right moment. The decrees are also theological. In Edition E, the king's counter-decree explicitly references the God of the Jews. The Persian king, in the Septuagint version, names the God who has preserved his people. Whether or not the historical Ahasuerus did anything like this, the theological move is striking. Most scholars think the document is a literary expansion rather than an actual Persian decree. The Greek Esther wants you to hear a pagan emperor acknowledge the God of Israel. That is not the only place the editions push the theology. Throughout the Greek expansions, references to God's providence, God's covenant, God's preservation of Israel are woven into the narrative. The Esther of the Septuagint is not just a story with God added. It is a story with the theology of God's covenant fidelity worked into every layer. And the result is a book that reads differently. The Hebrew Esther is a thriller, a court drama where God is silent. The Greek Esther is a theological narrative, a court drama where God is named, prayed to, and credited. Both are inspired in the traditions that hold them. Both tell the same events, but the texture is not the same. And the Christian who has only read the Hebrew Esther has only read half the book the early church knew. Think about how this would change a sermon. The pastor who only has the Hebrew text has to argue that God is hidden in the providence. The pastor who has the Greek text can simply read the prayer. The Hebrew sermon must work to defend the silence. The Greek sermon can preach Esther's voice. Both have their place, and for nearly 2,000 years of church history, the Christian preacher had both options on the page in front of him. Catholic and Orthodox preachers still do. Only Protestants, and only in recent generations, have read from Bibles that quietly leave the Greek option out. There is one more piece, the very last edition. After the Hebrew Esther, chapter 10, verse 3, where the book ends with a brief notice that Mordecai prospered in the king's court, the Greek Esther continues. The continuation is Edition F, and it returns to Mordecai's dream from Edition A. Then Mordecai said, "These things have come from God, for I remember the dream that I had concerning these matters, and none of them has failed to come true." The book ends by interpreting itself. Mordecai looks back over everything that has happened and identifies it as the fulfillment of the dream he was given. The tiny spring became the river. The two dragons fought. The righteous nation was saved. The whole story was prophesied before it happened. And then a postscript. The colophon of the Greek Esther names the year of its production and the translators who brought it from Hebrew into Greek. The Septuagint Esther is one of the few biblical texts that comes with a kind of signature. In the 4th year of the reign of Ptolemy and Cleopatra, Dositheus, who said that he was a priest and a Levite, and his son Ptolemy brought to Egypt the preceding letter about Purim. A Jewish family in Egypt, a father and a son, a priest and a scribe, carrying the story of Esther in Greek to the synagogues of the diaspora. The colophon is one of the earliest dated translation notices in the history of the Bible. Most scholars place it in the late 2nd or early 1st century BC. So you have, in the Greek Esther, a book that begins with a prophetic dream, contains prayers from the protagonists in the middle, quotes the actual decrees that drive the plot, and ends by tying everything back to the dream and naming the translators who carried it across the Mediterranean. That is a different book than what most modern Protestant Bibles have on their pages, and it is the same story that Catholic and Orthodox Bibles still tell in full. Read together. The Hebrew Esther and the Greek Esther are not in conflict. They are two windows into the same room. The Hebrew window shows you the courage of a young woman, the failure of a tyrant, the providence working in silence. The Greek window shows you the prayers behind the courage, the dream behind the providence, and the name of the God who never stopped moving. That is what gets recovered when you read both. Not a contradiction, a widening. And there is one more line in edition F worth noticing. Mordecai says, "And God remembered his people and vindicated his inheritance." The verb is emnesthe, the same root used in the Greek Old Testament for God's covenantal remembering. God remembered Noah in the flood. God remembered Abraham. God remembered the cry of Israel in Egypt. The Greek Esther closes the book by placing the deliverance under the canopy of every other Old Testament deliverance. God remembered. The story of Esther joins the longer story of every other story where God remembered his people. You do not have to accept these chapters as canonical to find them worth reading. Even Protestant scholars who reject the Apocrypha's canonical status agree that the editions are part of the literary history of the Bible. They are part of how the Septuagint sounded. They are part of what the apostles read. They are part of how the early church inherited the book. There is a version of Esther where God is silent. There is a version of Esther where she is praying on the floor in ashes. The Bible most modern Protestants read keeps her silence. The Bible most Christians around the world, Catholic, Orthodox, and the early church before them, fills it with her voice. Both are inspired traditions. Both are part of the wider Christian inheritance, and both are worth knowing about. So the next time someone tells you that Esther is the book where God never shows up, you can answer honestly. He shows up. He is named on the first page and the last. He is prayed to in the middle. The chapters where he is named have been part of the Christian Bible far longer than they have been absent from it. The question is not whether God is in Esther. The question is whether the version of Esther you have lets you hear him. If this opened something for you, leave one word in the comments, even one. Share this with someone who has only ever read the 10-chapter Esther. Subscribe if you want more of these deep dives into the wider biblical inheritance. And as always, God bless you.